Hi, I'm Angeline. Today we're going to talk just a little bit about the difference between a Kokopelli, a flute player, and a humpback flute player. They're different things, they're not the same, and if you want to be culturally sensitive, you'll want to know what the difference is between these things. Unfortunately, when the Spanish came to the North American Southwest, they weren't perfect at translating what all of the different imagery were and what they stood for. And so some of the words that they've created for some visual imagery from the prehistoric times have been misinterpreted in history, in the written history, and these myths have pervaded into the modern day. One of these is the Kokopelli. Now, what most people think of as the Kokopelli is what we call the humpback flute player, and he's this image that we're all familiar with. He's long and he's bent over and he's playing a flute, and we've come to call that a Kokopelli. Well, the Kokopelli, just right out of the gate, has nothing to do with flute player. Kokopelli is from Kokopelli. I'm sorry, I'm not awesome at pronouncing Hopi words, but it's a kachina, and it's a kachina that has nothing at all, nothing to do with a flute. Okay, it's a kachina. The kachinas are personalizations of natural forces. They're anthropomorphizing of natural forces. And this particular Kokopelli, shall we say, just doesn't have anything to do with the flute. So we take that right off the table. What we think of as Kokopelli is not Kokopelli. What does have to do with the flute? Well, there's two things. There are flute players, and there are cicadas. So let's start with the cicada. The cicada is this shape that looks like, I don't know, half of a circle. He's playing a flute, and he has a little erection, and he has little antenna. That's a cicada. That has come to be called a humpback flute player. It's actually a cicada. He heralds in the spring and the fertility of the spring. That's why he has an erection. And also the flute is played using the breath of life, breathing the breath of life. He shows up in the spring, he breathes the breath of life through his flute. Ergo, he is a flute player. And he has the humpback and he has an erection, and he heralds in the spring and all the things we think of as fertility that come with the spring. Another note on the breath of life and the flute is we all have the breath of life. The breath of life is the spirit within us. When we breathe, according to Southwestern tradition and the evolution of these symbols, right? We all have the breath of life in us. The breath of life comes from spirit. Spirit within us comes out in through the flute, goes back out the flute, and then it carries a message back to the spirit world in spirit form. It's playing the flute is speaking like spirit language. Okay, so then we move on to an actual flute player. A person who plays the flute is actually they're singing music. They're singing the language of spirit, using the spirit breath, using their life force, using the breath of life to put out through the flute, and putting that rhythm, that vibration, that even in if you really want to get technical with it, music has a vibration. It is a vibration. In ancient traditions all over the world, music intones the spiritual aspect of life. So a flute player is a blessed person in our society because they play the music, they intone the spirit of life, they communicate through the flute with their breath of life and the beautiful sounds that carry messages to spirit, carry that prayer, that sound, that vibration to spirit. So that's just a flute player. Then there's flute clan, and I won't get into that because that isn't something that I know enough about to talk about specifically, but I could suppose it has something to do with this honorable position of being the clan that plays the flute and all the things that I just talked about. And then we have the humpback flute player, a person who is a humpback flute player. And that would be, there's the story of a traveler that comes into town playing the flute, announcing his arrival with the happy sounds of the flute and all that suggests that we just talked about. You know, everybody would associate this with a very beautiful, happy, welcome sound. It's music, you know, and imagine a world where we don't have radios and TVs and then music floats in, you know, a strange music floats in from afar, and you see the traveler with his goods on his back, and he's got his seeds, or he's got whatever his wares are that's in his pack. He's Humpback, right? And he's playing the flute. And the myth of this guy is that he comes into town and he seduces all of the ladies in town, and he has his way with many of the ladies, and when he leaves, all the ladies are pregnant. That's kind of roughly how the story goes, but that's the association of this guy with the pack, with the flute, Humpback, flute player, and he has something to do with fertility, but it isn't in the same venerated sense like the cicada would be. Okay, so just to recap, Kokopelli is a Hopikachina that has nothing to do with flutes. The cicada is Humpback, plays the flute, he has an erection, and heralds in the fertility of spring. The flute player is a flute player, a wonderful person who can create music in this world. And then there's the Humpback flute player, the person who brings his pack, brings his flute, and he's a horny dude, and he causes that kind of stir in the community that has to do with fertility, but not in a very spiritual sense, just sort of in a raunchy, randy kind of sense. So I hope that helps you understand the differences, and I hope it helps you use proper verbiage when you see certain things and certain symbolism out in the world. One more thing I'll add is the concept of flowers. Flowers are associated with flutes, and you'll see in a lot of the antique Aztec flutes that they'll have this flower end, they'll have like a blossom at the end, so the flute will be long and thin and then kind of I don't know how you say, expand out at the end like a trumpet, and the engravings on it will look like a flower. Also, in the Aztec codices, when you see the pictures, you'll see people with like a little swirl coming out of their mouth. That's their speech swirl. But if you see one of those with a little flower next to it, that means music, or it is thought to mean music. And so the flute, when it has the flower at the end of it, when the flute itself blossoms into a flower, that's indicating that that's the music. And the flower is part of the spirit world. The flower is part of the germination of life. You know, it goes from seed to flower. It's symbolic of virility, fertility, life itself, and the fact that someone would put their breath of life, their spirit wind, through the flute, make that sound. It comes out as a spirit life with intonation, turns it into a flower, and that flower is being offered into the spirit world, and in all the beautiful connotations you can draw from that. I hope you enjoyed this. I have been making flute player art. I have it listed in my Etsy shop as Kokopelli / flute player because so many people associate it with flute player. But I've made this video because I want people to know the difference and learn the distinction. And I put a link to this in my listings in my Etsy shop, so that hopefully people will click on it and learn and go from this day forward using correct terminology for these things, because it matters. It matters to people who are still alive and still practice these ways and know the difference, and they should be respected. So have a wonderful, wonderful day, and from my breath of life to you, I hope this brought you some happiness. Have a wonderful day.